much for coming along.
Tēnā koe, I'm Evelyn Cole and I'm with the Environmental Protection Authority. I'm the Principal Advisor Strategy there, and in that role I have an influence in terms of the strategic direction that our organisation takes. In terms of my relationship with the environment, well, I'm a really keen gardener. I have 7 compost bins, so I suppose I walk the talk in that respect. But I'm really proud to work for the Environmental Protection Authority. It's the national environmental regulator. Our vision is an environment protected, enhancing our way of life and the economy, and we all like to walk that. It's really important to us. Our sort of elevator pitch is protecting people, protecting the environment, and so that's really important to us. We cover a vast range of work from hazardous substances, new organisms, that's genetic organisms as well, to the emissions trading scheme and environmental effects out in the exclusive economic zone. So our work touches probably everybody's life in terms of when you get up in the morning, if you clean your teeth. Well, we regulated that toothpaste, and you'll be pleased to know that it's not going to make you, well, hopefully it's not going to poison you, and through to as I said, with respect to many other things in terms of people's concern for the environmental impacts of developments. So that's me.
Cool, thank you, and thanks for agreeing to be a part of this panel. Yeah, Evelyn, you started to touch on my next question, but in your role, how can you influence sustainable policy, and how does sustainable policy impact the roles that you play in your different workplaces?
So from the representing in terms of the government, the environmental policies that the government has are set down at the highest level in our legislation. And the legislation that the Environmental Protection Authority looks after has sustainability at its core in many ways. So the Resource Management Act and the Exclusive Economic Zone Continental Shelf Act actually say that you have to give regard to the sustainable effects or impacts. I'll get the quotation wrong. So that's really important. Both of those, well, actually the Resource Management Act is just been subject to a big review, and I might answer that question later. But in terms of the wider stuff with our sustainable policy or the environment, it's really important in terms of the vision. And
sorry, Evelyn, do you think you could move the mic?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. In terms of the vision and our goals, they set the direction. So we're really very passionate about making sure that we actually make a difference. Our Chief Executive says our work is about making history every day. So the decisions that we make with respect to chemicals management, they will have impacts 20 years hence. So we're really conscious of that. And so that's really important from a sustainability perspective, that we take into account all of those impacts.
Yes, please.
How can you influence policy around sustainability, and how does that impact the work that you do?
Yeah, so first the first preface of this answer is that as local government or as a territorial authority, we don't actually have a lot of resource to work with. We get about 10% of the overall national expenditure, which means we don't have a lot to play with in terms of developing those solutions, which really sucks, because I do think that if we want to have more sustainable ways of living and enabling options for people to make those sustainable choices, we need a bit more of the share of the pie. So I'll preface it with that. But in terms of how I influence it, so I hold the portfolio for Wellington City for climate change, and that means that I work with our officers, so our staff at council, to develop what that plan looks like in terms of reducing our emissions. Currently we have a target for Wellington, which is to halve our emissions by the end of this decade and then to be carbon neutral by 2050, but hopefully we can kick that along a lot quicker, because we know we don't have that much time to waste, and we know that if we set targets far into the future that people kind of mess around until the very last minute. But I think being here in Wellington, we're really unique in that we are the capital city, and if we can be bold and ambitious with the environmental policy and all the other policy that we set, then we can really set a standard for the rest of the country. So yeah, I mean, it's currently, I think us in Auckland are really just fighting it out to be the most progressive in some ways, but I think from a kind of politician's angle, obviously we're not creating the policy straight off the bat, so we have a big role to play in terms of working with people. So working with the airport, working with Centreport, working with this university and Massey University, the hospitals, all of the really big stakeholders in the city, and really challenging them and asking them, are you doing enough to reduce your emissions? Are there ways that you can support your lowest paid workers to get to work in a way that they're not having to drive in every night? You know, so there's an array of different ways of doing it, but I think my big way of influencing policy is through collaborating with people around the city, taking a non-shameful approach. So if I get in the room with the airport, I'm not going to yell at them for not doing enough, although they aren't. You know, we're going to be saying to them, you know, if Vic Uni can be carbon neutral by 2030, then what's stopping you? And if we're investing in you and we own 33% of the shares in the airport, then what are you going to do to, you know, work for that and reduce your emissions and give back to the collective good of the city? So that's the way I think we influence it. So it's at a nationwide level, it's about being setting the standard and being a leader in the kind of local government space. In terms of relationships and within the city, it's about having good relationships and working with people. And in terms of a kind of organisational scale, it's working with officers, finding out where the potential is within the organisation and really driving towards that as well.
So my role as a lecturer, there's two main parts to my job. So one part is teaching and lecturing, and the other main part is about research. In terms of driving sustainable policy, so I guess the bulk of my research at the moment anyway is about environmental democracy. So my poor students that are here are probably really sick of hearing about this, but environmental democracy is like the processes, the practices, the frameworks through which we can imagine like a flourishing, good environmental future. And a really important component of environmental democracy is activism. So democracy is not just about elections that happen once every 3 years at a national scale. It's about the democratic fabric that sits around that and weaves through it all the time. So in terms of my research, I'm really interested in working with community groups and thinking about the barriers to environmental activism, the opportunities and the impacts from the individual scale right through to the national, the global scale. So what are the things that work, what are the things that don't work and lead to success, those sorts of things. So I think you know, people power shapes or should shape policy at least, as well as good science and good research. So that's one strand of my work. The other strand around lecturing and teaching is, you know, I'm so lucky to be teaching in environmental studies and geography, because most of our students really want to change the world, and so it's like this incredible dynamic space of like pumped up, passionate people. So my job, I think, is to help people develop the skills that are going to help them realise that world-changing kind of passion. So thinking about how they see the world around them and the critical lenses that they might see to get beyond, some of that shame-based stuff and into like identifying the structures like capitalism, like colonialism that are leading to injustice, and how we target the structures rather than blaming individual people. So that's a big part of my job. I don't know how well I do it, but I really enjoy it. So
I think you do a good job. So now we're just going to move on to some questions surrounding the elections. Why do you think voting in this election matters, and what role do young people play in this election in change making? Do you want to start, Tam?
All right. Well, I mean, I think everyone here has probably seen all of the stats and memes and information about how we, all right, got to remember these. I think it's that if we all enrolled to vote and we all voted, we would outnumber boomers? I don't know what. I think we are a very big block, but then again, I think that's under 55, so not... Anyway, it's obviously super important, and, you know, we all know that if you don't turn up, then, you know, you're not really considered by the parties as a group of people to create policy around, and I think a lot of decision makers know that climate change is like a really good area that you can engage young people and win over their vote, because it shows that they're thinking about us having a planet to live on. Yeah, I mean, I think it matters for a lot of reasons. And what role do young people have to play? Well, I think, especially just thinking about the university context, we have a lot of potential in that we all come from different places, and obviously we all come to uni every day, and that's a place where we learn lots of information and learn lots of different tools, but I think the really important work happens when you go back home and you're sitting at the dinner table, or you're hanging out with your friends, especially if you're from like rural communities, small towns, all of those kinds of environments. That's the really important role we have to play, is kind of disseminating that information. For me, like I was the first person in my whānau to go to university, so every time I would go home during a break, and during the 2017 election, I would go home and I'd talk to my parents. They don't have time to engage with this kind of information, so I'd say to them, well, what do you care about? And then they'd tell me, and I'd say, well, this party has this good policy, or maybe you shouldn't vote for this person in your electorate because blah, blah, blah. So I think we play a role as connectors, but we have to do better, and we have to be moving outside of our bubbles. Like, we can't just be sitting in our own like-minded bubbles all the time, convincing the same people who already think the same as us to get out and vote. We have to give people a reason to want to vote, and we have to be talking to normal people. So like, when you go grab a coffee, have a chat to the person who's serving you, or I don't know, when you're on the bus, have a little chat to people. So talk to normal people, because, that's what's really going to make a difference. So at the moment, I'm thinking about how do we engage young workers, young whānau, people who aren't at university, people who aren't in training, because that's what that's where we're going to be able to make a real difference. Yeah.
Well, I think it's really important that everybody gets out and vote, and it's really fantastic that everyone's enrolled. It's really hard. I totally agree with that. If you could try and influence one other person who thinks it was a waste of time voting because their vote won't matter, if you manage to get them to go to the poll, that's hugely beneficial. I know for the local government elections, my daughter works for VUWSA New Zealand, and she was up at Auckland at the time, and they bought the voting boxes into their office. So they have a lot of people who are in shift work, and a lot of people who had never ever voted. Now, they don't know how much influence it has, but little things like that, even if there was another 10 people who voted, that would be great. So any piece of influence that you can have to get, I think I heard the statistic was that you could have a 24% shift if people under 30 all voted.
That's powerful.
Yeah, I think voting is a very important tool in our toolbox. So it can feel, I think, a little bit, like I feel a little bit annoyed about the lack of progress across many different indicators in the past 3 years. Like, I feel like some things, really fundamental things, could have changed, like benefits could have been increased drastically to improve people's everyday lives, and I'm really frustrated that hasn't happened in a significant way. However, and I would understand how people would then think out the other side of that, well, shit, my vote doesn't make a difference anyway. But I think that's kind of focusing too much on voting as the end in of itself, and this is the importance, I think, of thinking about the multitude of tools that we have to push the social and environmental agenda towards greater justice. So, I would still vote the same way given the opportunity, knowing what's happened the past 3 years, but I think we need to get much better at thinking about voting as just one of many different tools, and we've, like Tamatha said, we've got to be backing this stuff up with conversations in our communities, all of our communities, all the time, to be actually fundamentally shifting things.
What other tools do you see as being important that we could utilise?
I think there's lots of things. I think we've talked in class, sorry again to students, about the importance of good information, like the importance of having access to good information about what's happening, and we're at this real funny crossroads at the moment where there's a lot of shit information out there, but we're also clawing back some kind of good stuff. So stuff is starting to do better reporting. I've noticed since they changed ownership, and so I've started actually paying them because they're back in local ownership. So seeking out good information sources and kind of socialising them, I think, is a massive one. And the more we can support good information, the better. I just need to think about my dad. I think that's also one of the great things about, speaking in this university context. One of the key skills that students hopefully come out with is about, like, critical thinking about information. And that is a real privilege. So my dad did 6 months at Lincoln University and dropped out. And whatever, like he's had a good working life since then, but I do really notice that he doesn't have the same toolkit around understanding information. So you give the man access to YouTube over lockdown. Oh man, it's such a bad time. Bloody hell. He sent me something from Breitbart the other day. It was just a disaster. So that's information is one of the things that we really need to be kind of better at, and using the skills and privilege that we have to have conversations with people about that. I could go on, but that's probably just one unique.
I've found, especially with last week with passing our climate action plan, I've been doing lots of reading into what kind of messaging does and doesn't work when you're trying to convince somebody to go out of their way to do something, I guess, politically or whatever. And I think, especially when it comes to climate change, we really do need to avoid the crisis framing. It just doesn't work. It turns people off because it makes them feel not hopeful. And when people realise the scale of the problem, it just makes them even less likely to vote, because why would you when you realise the scale of the problem and you're kind of just well, my vote's not going to reverse all of this. So I think it's talking to people from a values basis. So and also evidence and numbers, I think, isn't when you're having a corridor with someone, isn't that compelling. It's more about stories and talking about things that you value and things that they might value as well, and then kind of pivoting from that point and talking about the importance of collective action rather than emphasising the individual element of voting. So I think just being, it's not you have to be relentlessly positive in a toxic way, but just being constructive and really emphasising collective, it's about collectivism, all of us doing our part. Think about the lakes or the rivers you love swimming in during summer. Think about, preservation of birds that you love that made your lockdown experience a bit better. Really talking about those stories and emphasising that collective good, I think, is pretty important.
Just building off of that, what do you see as maybe your top 3 or biggest environmental or sustainability issues this election? Big question.
I think that climate change is, where the Prime Minister put it last election, was the nuclear power moment for this generation. And so I think that climate change is still very much one of the big issues for the election. Fresh water is definitely, and the whole issue about water management, water quality and access to the 3 waters, the elements there is really big. And I can't think offhand of a third one, which is really bad. I'm sure there will be immediately.
I totally agree, especially with the 3 waters stuff. All right, so I think the number 1 for me will be transport, because that just plays a role in everybody's life, no matter where you live in New Zealand. And so I'm looking out for who's proposing. For me, it's about giving people options. So I think as governors or as decision makers or as politicians or whatever, it's about giving people as many options as possible. And then when you match that with education and awareness, that allows people to make the most socially or environmentally responsible decision. So transport's definitely a big one, especially here in Wellington. I do not want another tunnel running through Mount Victoria. I want trains and alternatives to flying. I want to see better investment in walking and cycling in Wellington, but also in rural places as well. So transport's definitely a big one for me. So be looking out for that. Another thing is job creation. So obviously post-COVID we're looking at making lots of jobs, but I want to see what kind of sustainable green jobs we can create, especially for those who are out of work. But where I'm from Tokoroa, and we are a forestry town, we're a farming town. Everyone is employed at the paper mill, at the cheese factory, or on a farm somewhere. So, I've been thinking heaps about a just transition. And so for me, if there's a party who's going to go in there and create some sustainable jobs so that people can transition out of the dirty jobs and into good green jobs, I will support that party. And I guess my third thing is Indigenous policy. So I want to see more environmental stuff given back to iwi to manage that. So recently we've seen I think water management in Taupua has been given back to Ngāti Tūwharetoa, which is awesome. And I think also Te Puia, the geyser in Rotorua, has been given back to Te Arawa, or the hapu that is in that area. So I want to see more, I want to see those natural assets being given back to iwi, because we are the kaitiaki. We have been living in and around those areas for hundreds and hundreds of years. We know how to look after them. We need the power, decision-making power, and the resources to be able to look after those, because those are our tupuna. You know, those lakes, those rivers, those maunga, those are our tupuna. Therefore, we should be looking after them. So that's the 3 things I'll be looking out for.
Yeah, just picking up on one of those points about the recovery. So one priority, I think, is a just recovery, and specifically also like a gendered just recovery. So there was one report out last week that there's 11,000 jobs have been lost so far, and 10,000 of those were women. And I'm worried that the investment we're seeing in big infrastructure, they're in jobs that are dominated by men. They're quite masculinized kind of types of jobs, like construction, for example. And yeah, I think women should be in construction, but also that training people up and changing and reforming those workplaces to make them actually hospitable to women is kind of a longer term graft. I think instead we should be thinking about places that are kind of, female dominated workplaces, and why are they not getting the same investment? Thinking particularly about care work and education. So we know, for example, our teaching workforce is ageing, so why aren't we investing a whole lot in training a whole lot of teachers right now? Our health workforce, health carers, all of those, that we should be investing in those sorts of places as well. And that chat is not happening because it doesn't look as nice as some big new bridge or a new road, for example. So that would be one, a gender kind of just transition as well as recovery, transition into a more just kind of economy and society. The second would be democracy. So many of you will have noticed that an amendment was made to the RMA to facilitate this big infrastructure. So basically, some of these shovel-ready projects will not be vetted, checked, read by the community. They will just get signed off by the Minister for the Environment. That's a huge worry for me, because they have made terrible decisions in the past when similar things have been brought in. Post-earthquake Kaikoura, they ended up building a cycleway that was going to go through an urupa. Bad decision making if there's no checks and balances, right? So I want better democracy. That should be a priority. And then the third is actually constitutional transformation. So I want to take a longer view out to be thinking about our environment, our whole environment. So if you haven't heard of Mātiki Mai and that project, thinking about constitutional transformation by 2040, the more just, better, decolonised, treaty-based ways that we can live together in this place. And I think good environmental outcomes will flow from that if we work out some of the some of the issues that plague this place at the moment, because we haven't fulfilled, we Pākehā haven't fulfilled the promise of the Treaty of Waitangi.
I love this. I just want to build upon something both of you have mentioned, and maybe Evelyn you'd like to add to it as well. But what actually is a just transition?
So I just wrote a chapter in a BWB text about this, coming out in November. It's called Living in the Climate Crisis, or living in a climate crisis, I think. But I think it's just it's about acknowledging the fact that the poorest, most vulnerable people in our society have done the least to contribute to climate change, and therefore we need to make sure that, one, not only are they not impacted the most, because we know that that's what will happen, because wealthier people have more access to things like EVs and energy efficiency, making their homes energy efficient, but it also means making sure that, well, in my perspective, it means making sure they can play an active role in the decarbonisation of our society, so that they can be, active agents of change, making them feel empowered that they can contribute to that. So that's what I think a just transition is. And I think it also means making sure that they can fully participate in democracy as well, because I remember when I was at uni a few years ago, I sort of thought that maybe we needed a bit more, some kind of benevolent ruler to come down and tell us all what we have to do, and to stop people from making, environmentally bad decisions, but then the more I learnt about it in an international context, the more I learnt that actually the greatest way that we can give back to our environment and look after it is actually devolving that power from Parliament into local communities. And that's why Mā Teke Mai is such a good report, because it offers up te tiriti-based models for what an alternative governance or like power sharing arrangement might look like. So it might be that in like a regional context, that local councils and iwi and hapu are given way more resources and power so that they can actually look after those decisions, so that they can invest in sustainable transport solutions, so that they can make sure that housing, particularly social housing, is warm and dry and retains energy. So to me, that's what a just transition looks like. It's not only ensuring that, disadvantaged communities are not further disadvantaged by the changes that we make, but it's actually making sure that they can actively be involved in a local setting that allows them to have real power and really self-determine what those solutions look like.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty excellent definition of a just transition. So an really important part of the kind of whakapapa of talking and thinking about just transitions has been the union movement. So a really key part of it is that there are good jobs for everyone. And so one example, it might be relates to transport, and it might be that driving a bus is a good, well-paid, valued job within society, and that public transport is free and regular and reliable and accessible. So if you are a cleaner doing a night shift in Wellington and you live in Porirua, you know you can get the bus into town safely and for free, and that the driver who's driving you is paid well for their time to do that. So that's an example of a just transition. Wins socially, economically and environmentally. So those are the sorts of things, like it's not necessarily really hard stuff. A lot of it is really commonsensical and gets at all of those kind of wins and gains, yeah.
Evelyn, do you want to add to that?
I'll talk from a slightly different perspective in terms of, as a person in the government sector and involved in decision making, a really important part about any just transition, or just making sure that when you are making decisions, you actually take into account the views and the needs across New Zealand. And it's always a balancing equation. It's really difficult. And the hardest thing about any of this is that what one faction may think is a just transition, another faction may think is the worst transition. But that doesn't mean that all of the views need to be taken into account, and they all have to be considered appropriately and equitably. And in the end, the reason that we want to have, we need to vote, is that we are all part of our community. The reason that you have a government is that they represent the community and hopefully all of its views. It's not just, you don't just represent or look after the people who voted for you. When you're in power, you actually have to take into consideration the whole country's needs. And so just transition is making sure that you are considering future generations, existing generations, and all of those things, as well as the environment as a person, in terms of we do have such things as I'm not sure that's the right way of expressing it, the Wanganui River has personhood, and that's really important too. So yeah, just adding that.
Cool, thank you. So looking at policy, why is having sustainable policy important, and what does policy around sustainability that is good look like to you? Who wants?
Do you have any?
Oh yeah, you might be there. Yeah, from the top.
Well, I think sustainable policy is really important. But I'll just give a slightly different dimension, because there's a whole lot of, the question about whether sustainable, which has got a whole lot of definitions around it at the top, is the appropriate term at the moment, is out for debate, and it's covered off actually quite well by the Resource Management Review Panel in their very long report, but I would just read little parts of it if I was you. But one of the things that we've been discussing at the Environmental Protection Authority is it's not just about leaving the environment in no worse a state. That's just not good enough, is our perspective now. there's a whole lot of things that need to actually be redressed, or that we need to know that we're trying to enhance things, making things in a better position. And so I think that that's a really important element of sustainability. So that's at the top.
100%, and then down at the lower level, at the us on the ground in local government, I would say, I mean, yes, sustainable policy obviously important, but it's how we tell that story, I think, is the most important part, because if, you know, we could have something that's evidence-based and goes out and, you know, environmentalists are happy with it, but if the public aren't happy with it, then that's a good way to just get it chucked out straight away. So in terms of that policy in itself being sustainable, we have to be able to tell that story, but we also have to be able to, again, provide options for people so that they can make that choice for themselves. Because if people don't, like, I feel like if people feel they're being forced to do something, then that's just going to cause a lot of kickback, and then in comes the politicians weakening and diluting that stuff. So yeah, I think, yeah, telling the story, empowering people, giving them options, that's what a good sustainable policy looks like to me. So for example, when we just put out our action plan for being a zero carbon capital, a lot of that is premised on the assumption that we will have 77,000 EVs in the capital city by 2030, and there's like 1,700 in the city currently. So to me, like, that isn't really that sustainable of a policy, because most people can't afford EVs, and although they might get a bit cheaper over time, the purpose of transport in the future of transport is not individual vehicles. It's actually moving lots of people with fewer vehicles. So having good mass rapid transit, good bus routes, accessible and affordable bus routes, free preferably. You know, so it's actually like, it's, to me, sustainable policy is about moving away from individualism and moving towards people being collective citizens and feeling like they can really take part and be an active part of society. So it's looking at transport, and it's looking at you know, the density of housing, making sure that we're actually building communities, not just individual houses. Another kind of key kind of contention when it comes to local government is car parks. So that is like the most controversial thing in council and in Wellington City. Like, ask any resident, they will fight you to protect their individual car park. So we've actually got to shift these mindsets away from, this is my individual right to my individual private property here, even though you could build an apartment block here and house homeless people, or even though here's my car park and this is my individual car park and I don't want to put a cycleway through there. It's about making people want to be citizens who are participating as a collective.
Oh yeah, that's such good points. I think the other thing I would add to that is that it's about it being long term. Like, so sustainable policy is about taking a longer term approach. So rather than us thinking that our economy is good because we spent 3% more at Christmas last year, like I think we need to lengthen our horizons a whole lot. I do get a little bit annoyed with the word sustainable, because I feel like the political nature of it has been hollowed out over time. So that's why I talk a lot more about notions of justice, because EVs might be sustainable here, but they're really unjust for people in other places whose whenua there have been completely destroyed in the interests of making yet another thing that we can consume from here. So I get a little bit annoyed with sustainability, and because I think it enables this focus on technological fixes, that if we just have the new, better technology, things will be fine. And I think that misnames the problem. In fact, this constant need for newness is how we got here, and how such vast inequalities exist, and why the problem is around consumption and economic form. It's not necessarily technology. It's not necessarily that we just don't have the right technology yet. I don't think.
I agree. So around the sustainable, well, you don't like that word, but around that, that policy sphere, is there anything that's currently happening or has happened over the past 3 years that have really excited you, or you thought it's been really good?
Yeah, so I'll go quickly. One thing that really was super, super exciting actually was announced right in here in 2018, and that was the decision to end the tendering or block offer process for offshore oil exploration for oil and gas. There was some big problems with it, and there's still provisions for onshore exploration in Taranaki, and those offers are still going out and being auctioned off as we speak. But it was this kind of incredible shift in thinking around what we can do, and we know was made possible because of the organising of iwi and hapu and community groups across the country, and that was just profoundly like, oh man, it was so hopeful. It was like this amazing example of like people working together in their places to shift the narrative, to shift what was possible and what was doable. So to me, that was an incredible kind of hopeful moment, and yeah, it was so wild to be here amongst it all as well. Yeah.
Yes, I was here in that year, but I missed out on it. But yes, it looked pretty cool. I guess just what I said before about like local authorities giving that power back to iwi and hapu, I think is really exciting in that kind of local space. Yeah, I think that's...
I suppose I'm going to take a slightly different tack in that actually there's often a lot of small things that are happening that people have very marginal interest in and but make a huge difference. So one of the areas that the Environmental Protection Authority looks after is ozone layer protection, and that's the layer that if it wasn't protected, we'd all be sunburnt when we walked out at any point in time, which is terribly not healthy. And it's really bad for the whole environment. And so there are little things that have been improving year upon year with the sort of things there. So those are often it is those little things. I think the Climate Change Response Act and the changes that have happened there got some really, and they had almost unanimous support within Parliament, which is actually really great that people recognise that it's a really important area. So there will now, the Ministry for the Environment has put out, I'm going to get the name of the Climate Change Risk Assessment, and that's going to then go forward to be used for writing a climate change adaptation plan. It's very exciting that we're actually doing something like that. It sounds terribly boring, and I'm sure about 0.001% of the population will get involved and excited about it, but actually it will make a big difference to our lives. So yeah.
Yeah, that adaptation plan is actually really important, especially here in Wellington, because we are like super at risk, like our CBD, our central city, the south coast, the eastern suburbs, like so much of our city is vulnerable to sea level rise. So I'm actually really excited about that adaptation plan as well.
Tam, I just want to ask you about kind of the work that you're doing in the Wellington City Council. Planning for growth, how does that, that's quite an exciting thing. How do you think that impacts things around the environment and all of that?
Yes, so that's great point. Yes, I was actually hoping that we would have some kind of an adaptation plan ready for by the time this planning for growth came up, but hey, here we are. So planning for growth is our spatial plan for Wellington City. So really that just sets out the measures or the rules in which people like us or, I don't know, developers or homeowners, whatever, how they can work with and use the land for different purposes. So like, I don't know, building an apartment block, building a home, lots of building, anything to do with that, but even things like our green belts and protecting those and making sure that those are places that can be homes for our manu, our insects, all of those things. So that is a consultation that has gone out today, and there's, I guess in terms of environmental impact, I guess it's mostly about housing. So it's like, so in Wellington, there's a lot of emphasis on heritage. So there's, obviously we've got a bit of a character. People like, Mount Vic, they like the way that looks. They like Aroa Valley, the way that looks in terms of its character. However, those character and those heritage values and the kind of restraints that puts around development in those areas means that we can't actually do a lot in those areas. So we can't build high density housing, so packing more people into smaller spaces. But we know that the city in the next 30 years is going to grow by 50 to 80,000 people, and we already know that there's not enough housing as it is. It's really hard finding a flat when you rock up and there's like 50 other people there, and then you have to talk to the landlord and try to bump your rent up by like another $10 just to guarantee a place. So it's obviously a problem. We obviously need to build more houses. They need to be closer together, and then we need good public amenities, so having lots of green space, lots of cafes around, good walking, cycling infrastructure, good bus routes all throughout the city. So basically, what will happen with this consultation, what I'm hoping doesn't happen, is that people who have more time and more privilege, so people that own homes or that are retired and have a lot of time on their hands, are able to participate and say, no, I don't want any big buildings in my neighbourhood. I want only, a standard house with a backyard. That's all I want in my neighbourhood, and that's the way that I want to keep it. It's really important that we acknowledge that we're the capital city. We need more housing. Wellington is an attractive place to live. That's why we all chose to live here. And so we really need to participate in that process and let council know that actually we want more houses and we want to be able to live in warm, dry housing and have lots of access and not have to scrap over our shitty housing stock. Did you know 40% of houses in Wellington are damp and mouldy? And we probably live in 100% of those houses. So it's really important that we have our say. So if you're keen to do that, just Google Planning for Growth, WCC, and that will come up on Google, or just do that at some point over the next few weeks and just have your say. I know it sounds a little bit nerdy and a little bit boring, but it's super important. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck with the same situation that we have to deal with year on year. So this is our chance to change, and we only get this opportunity every 30 years, I believe. So yeah, go and do that if you can.
Yeah, and there's a pretty clear link between medium to high density housing and emission levels. So everyone got to submit on that. So just moving on, we talked a bit about a just transition, but I want to look at what is climate justice and kind of how is climate justice, how does that intersect with policy around environmental issues?
So climate justice is the idea, the fact, that those least responsible for climate change will feel the brunt of its effects the most. And so a climate just future addresses the inequalities that already exist, rectifies the inequalities that already exist in society. So any response to climate change must be also about addressing social ills and inequalities. What was the second part of your question?
How does climate justice intersect with policy around environmental issues? Yeah,
so I think there could be much stronger intersections and much more nuanced conversation about these things. So I come back to the idea of technological fixes. There's some pretty loud voices advocating for things like subsidies for electric vehicles, and that makes me kind of annoyed because, again, it's back to the kind of individualism and not getting at some of the fundamental basic things that are wrong at the moment. So, for example, housing, if we invested in a whole lot of retrofitting social housing to be warm and dry and healthy, that's better for the environment in terms of energy use and the longevity of those homes. It also saves us a whole lot of money in our healthcare system, and it's better for people who otherwise struggle to access good housing. So I think these things are really complicated, and it's actually really hard then, if they're complicated, to have a chat about climate justice and someone wants to talk to you about emissions, and maybe the easiest way that they get to is through electric vehicles, and actually you want to talk about retrofitting houses. You kind of have to take them on a little bit of a pikihaere, a bit of a journey to get there. But that's the sort of chat that we need. And again, I think that once we have those conversations, it shows that lots of the things that we can do really easily and readily about climate change are not that complicated or hard, and they're good on multiple measures. So, climate justice is about intersecting axes of justice and doing all of the things all at the same time.
I was just thinking, it's really important when you're talking there about, I just lost my thought. I was thinking about the work that the Treasury has been doing on the wellbeing analysis, which is, and one of the things that's really interesting about that, and if you haven't looked at it, it is actually quite worthwhile, but it doesn't compartmentalise things, so it points out that a decision or a policy that affects a social area is also likely to have an environmental impact and an economic impact. And so what you were mentioning before about if you invest in certain areas in the housing, then that has flow on. And I think that is recognised in a lot of the government's work. In the area that I work on, that we don't have, well, actually we do have social as well as environmental in terms of when we were talking before about hazardous substances. So if you want to have a substance that is going to be achieving some good environmental outcomes, such as a really strong aquatic herbicide to kill a pest weed, but that also is got health elements to it in terms of it actually affects the waterway for a certain period of time, the people who are working and spraying that. So those things all come into it. I think that's a really important part of that side when it was really useful to have your description of climate justice, which I wasn't aware of.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to add, Tam, or you? Okay.
Well, I guess just like to put that into maybe all of that into like maybe some practical examples. If we were going to be taking a just approach to the way that we do stuff at City Council, I think the first place we would focus is on our social housing. So we have tens of thousands of tenants in Wellington that live in our social housing. We're like the third biggest landlord in the country. So like the first place that I would want to start is by retrofitting all of those buildings and making sure that they're warm and dry, and that would be the first place you would want to start, because, that's not their responsibility. They don't own those buildings, we do. So that would be a good place to start. Transport, another super, really big area that we could work on, which is why the regional council is important as well. But in terms of public transport, something we could look at straight away is how do we, giving students a discount, or giving young families or workers discounts. So that's kind of an example of those kind of just transition or climate just kind of viewpoints in action.
Yeah, this kind of leads into my next question, which is about the future of policy around all these environmental and sustainability issues. What changes do we need to see? I know the list is probably a bit long, but...
Well, really, that was the same as I said before. If you use the wellbeing analysis, it gives you quite a different perspective in the way you approach your policy decisions. So you're looking at it from the lens of a whole lot of different things, which range from civil justice or civic justice through to the environment and economic and the actually there's a large range of them which I cannot remember offhand, but yeah, I think that makes a big difference in policy.
Sorry, I've totally forgot what the question is.
No. What changes do we need to see in sustainable policy or policies around environmentalism or sustainability?
Well, it kind of has to be embedded into every policy, because so it's about, I think there need to be, and there probably already are, you'd be able to tell me, but we need some good frameworks or kind of lenses that we can strain all policy through. So the most important thing is we're not siloing the environmental the environmental impacts of any and all policy, from housing to social policy, whatever it is. So we have to be straining it all through that lens, and we have to have really good frameworks to do that. But I think at a kind of decision-making level, it's about thinking about who our most vulnerable communities are, and then thinking about the policy that you're looking at and what options does that lay out for that person or for someone in that community or someone or a family there. What options do they have based on that policy? And if they've got none, or if they've got one, then that's not a just policy, and that's just going to further reinforce, inequity. So, so I think avoiding silos is really important. We try do that at council. So whenever we get a paper about anything that's relevant to council, on the last page there's various different areas that have to be considered. So we have to take into account climate, emissions implications. We have to take in te tiriti or waitangi implications. We have to take in, obviously, risk and financial implications and all that stuff. But I think another important part is that policy is only as good as the people who create it. So it's actually about people in these organisations in the public sector being culturally and environmentally competent, because you can't rely on decision makers every time to be picking out every little element and thinking about the policy implications of every little word that you use, especially when it comes to legislation or regulation of any kind. So it's about actually making sure that the people that are creating this policy are up to scratch with knowing things, and I think that actually takes it back takes it like thinking long term. That's why in our education system at a primary and a secondary level, we have to have good environmental understandings throughout there, and it has to be interwoven with Indigenous understandings of the environment, because that is what is natural to Aotearoa. So if we're embedding that and making sure that the generations that we're raising are environmentally conscious, they're culturally competent, they know how to navigate Aotearoa both socially and environmentally, then that is how in time, long term, you're going to have policy creators and analysts and writers who are actually making policy that is sustainable in its truest sense.
So changes we need to see in the future, pushing the boat out into the future. The changes we need to see, I think, are that we have a complete change in our economic system, away from capitalism, a system that values economic growth, profit that's extracted from people and nature, and away from a Eurocentric dominance in everything that we do in Aotearoa New Zealand, and kind of the racism that underpins a whole lot of that. So that's like looking out, that's what we need to get there. I think that we have to be much more sophisticated in naming those two things, that it's totally fine to criticise both of those things, that there are things beyond capitalism. We can have wonderful, flourishing futures where we're not consuming heat, but we feel more connected, we do more stuff nearby. There's a whole lot of beautiful things that can flow from a non-capitalist future, and there's heaps of examples all over the world of those things already existing. So we need to talk about those things more and amplify them, and how things could be radically different. We don't need one big economic system to take over. I'm not saying we need communism everywhere now, but we can have, and if you want to advocate for that, go for it, you should. We shouldn't be so constrained to just imagining our future within the capitalist framework that we are kind of raised within. So that's the long-term thing, I think, and the chat that we have now is really important to getting us there. So criticising those things, naming alternatives like Mātiki Mai, like Ngāti Tūwharetoa managing waterways, for example. So that's pushing the boat out. Coming back to kind of now, maybe, I think one of the big things that we also need to do is change the way tax operates in this country. I can't believe secondary tax still exists. What a big old pile of horse shit that is. Why should you be taxed so much for working 2 jobs? That's bonkers to me. And then we also have some of the lowest tax rates for our highest earners. How is that fair? Like, we could easily have lots of the nice things in our community if we changed those 2 wee things. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk briefly about, the thing that is kind of scaring me a little bit at the moment, is like the gloriousness of living in this island nation. Like, we're so lucky. There's lots of things that have fed into that luck, but it freaks the shit out of me that we're going to start becoming border worshippers, and we're going to become really nationalistic. And in a climate changing future, that is not what we need to do or can do or should do when we have global responsibilities. And we, as a developed country, have contributed, not evenly across our society, but have contributed a vast amount more than many other places in terms of per capita to climate change. So we have responsibilities. And just more than that, we have responsibilities as good neighbours. We should be neighbourly. And so the implications of this current kind of border worship scare me quite a lot. So I think we also need to keep a careful eye on the nationalism that we are starting to see come through in the chat about the COVID response as well.
I really like your vision for a non-capitalist future. What do you think is stopping us from getting there?
Okay, well, I think the main thing is that there are people who have accumulated a lot of power, and not just people, but corporations. There are systems in place that lock us in. So there are people that do very well out of capitalism, have amazing lives out of capitalism, and have done that by accumulating a whole lot of power. And this also comes back to information, our information sources. So we're really lucky here not to have Murdoch-dominated media, but that's not the case in lots of other countries. So what's stopping getting us there is power, but power is also the thing that gets us beyond that. So power is not fixed. It rests with particular people and organisations at different times, but it doesn't stay there forever. And when we work together and collectivise, that's when we claw it back. And I think the other thing that is stopping us from getting there is talking about, thinking, imagining different ways of being in the future. And I think I feel that responsibility keenly in and that research and the teaching part of my job actually is how we imagine, articulate beautiful, flourishing, fair, just futures. I think that's something that there's so much more intellectual, emotional energy that should be put into. I think that's holding us back a wee bit as well. Yeah.
Did any of you want to add to that, or you're okay? I might open the floor to questions now. Does anyone have any questions? Wow, we have 2 questions. Okay. Oh, 3. Okay, I'll come around to you. My foot's gone a bit to sleep, but that's okay.
So Wellington is quite iconic for its old villa style of living. However, the villas are in turn possibly the most mouldy and damp and dilapidated flats. And I guess my question to you would be, do you see there being any push within council or government or whatever level to have the owners of those villas, while of course appreciating their heritage value, looking at how they can make them healthier, safer places to live?
Well, I guess I thought that was what the healthy homes standards were supposed to do, but I think the problem with that one is that there's like little resource behind enforcement. So I think with this, so were you here when I was talking about planning for growth? So that's exactly what I was talking about before. So at the moment, we've got a consultation out on our planning for growth, which is our spatial plan. So that looks at heritage listing and character value, and you know, all those villas and how they're terrible houses, and they stop us actually from developing, you know, making more houses. But I think so through that consultation, if we relax some of those heritage controls, then that allows homeowners to do more, because currently if you have a house that was built before 1930, you have to apply for a resource consent to make any improvements on the house, usually. And obviously that varies depending on where you are, but that's kind of the standard. So if we can kind of loosen that a little bit, so it's not such a mission for landlords to go through and do that work, then that will make it easier. So that goes back to us, the ones that live in those houses, actually participating in that consultation process. And then if a majority of people come back and say, actually we value warm, dry and abundant housing stock over those character areas or those, you know, old school villas, then that's what we'll do. But ultimately we're constrained by what the community says. So I'll be getting out and trying to help get people mobilised and involved. I know VUWSA's got lots of stuff involved. I'll be going to the high schools and talking to them, because ultimately, you know, they're the ones that are going to be living in these houses as well. So I think that's kind of the key thing. So we've got an opportunity right now until October the 5th, I think, to have our say in that. So lots of cool stuff to come, eh, Grace?
Yeah, very exciting.
Hi, I've got one from Evelyn. It's not coming through, is it? So I'm looking forward to the day that CO2 and methane emissions are treated as hazardous substances, but until they do, and knowing that it's the kaupapa of your organisation to protect the environment, don't you feel like the EPA is held captive by the oil industry? You're really kind of a link in the predatory delay chain?
So I disagree that the Environmental Protection Authority is held captive by the oil industry. So when we have decisions with respect to if somebody wishes to do offshore exploration or even extraction, we have to follow what's set out in the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Act, and that does allow for extraction and for exploration drilling. There's obviously that's stopped for new blocks offers, but the existing ones are allowed, and we have to follow what's set out in terms of the requirements for balancing that. The government did not change that law, and the EPA is required to follow those laws when it makes the decisions.
Hi, my name's Jesse. I'm running for Parliament here in Wellington, and my question's to Tamatha Paul. You mentioned how here in Te Whanganui, Aotearoa Wellington, we don't get a big enough share of the pie in terms of national funding for conservation and climate measures. What do you think are some of the barriers to that lack of resources, and what kind of things would you like to see happen if you saw an increase in that funding and resources?
So I think that comment is not just to environmental, like we just don't have enough money to deal with any of the problems. So we've got massive challenges. Our three waters, I don't know if you've seen the news pre-COVID, but pipes are bursting all over the city. We've got wastewater flowing out into the ocean. We don't have nearly enough houses for people. We don't have enough money to go and do, public transport improvements to the roads by ourselves. So we're like beholden to the government. Every time we need something done, we have to go to them with our hands out. That's not the way that it should be. When people come to us with a problem, we should be able to respond to that with the appropriate kind of like powers to make it happen, or with the funding to be able to make stuff happen. So, I guess that's like a problem for all issues. And going back to the whole democracy thing, I think we can get our best solutions, and and international evidence tells us that we can get the best solutions to all of our problems if we have greater resources in communities, so that we can create solutions. Because it's no surprises that when a one size fits all solution comes out of Parliament, that it's going to either screw over urban New Zealand or rural New Zealand, because or the North Island or the South Island. I think we can all agree that that just doesn't make any sense. So, we need more resources. So all of the countries that we prop up as being these excellent countries, Finland, Sweden, Japan, all of these countries, their kind of municipal authorities get more than 30% of their their national expenditure. So that's a solution that I think we don't talk about a lot, but it makes sense. Why not? Because it is such a far away thing, and it's also a difficult thing. I wouldn't even know the first step to that. I think it would be a part of the constitutional transformation corridor, because you would have to have greater decision-making powers at a local level, so Parliament would actually have to give some of that power away. But can you ever imagine a member of Parliament being like, oh no, let's just give away some of our power? It's just never going to happen, especially with the current context. We've got government who have just developed all of the stuff around urban development, where they're going to go through and do these significant projects and totally ram through any local kind of checks and balances on making sure that it's appropriate. That cycleway through an urupa, as an example of that power. But then you've also got the three waters. So the government is proposing taking all of our water assets into their control, so that they can have greater investment. That's just not the answer. So it kind of concerns me that we're moving further and further towards centralisation. I don't know what the solution to that looks like, to be honest, but it's probably all of us brushing up on what constitutional transformation should look like. So reading Mātike Mai, looking at other models around the world, thinking about how we can devolve some of that power. But it is a tricky one. It's a long-term one as well. But good luck with Parliament too. That's pretty cool. That's awesome, seeing young people standing.
Kia ora, my name's Oscar. I was just going to ask, would you guys be able to elaborate any plans or steps in place to accommodate the population growth and the associated waste that will come with that? Like waste management improvement?
Waste management policy is actually under the auspices of the Ministry for the Environment, and the Associate Minister for the Environment, Eugenie Sage, has quite a big interest in this topic. I am not aware, but I'm sure there has been work done looking at the correlation between increasing population and waste management, but I'm sorry I can't give you more details. The Ministry for the Environment website is really informative, so it could help.
I don't know, but I'm going to talk about something that's relevant to Wellington. So it's kind of scary, because we're looking at a landfill extension. So the southern landfill, we're about to reach capacity of that very soon, in the next 5 years. So we're looking at what happens there. So that's really scary, because if we extended that landfill, that takes out so much space where most, a lot of our, biodiversity, a lot of our native, well, actually I don't know about native trees, but lots of birds live there for sure. So that's really concerning. So, but then again, when you take a just transition element to it, there's some people who are saying, let's just use Porido or the huts dumps, which is just, that's typical Wellington, take a rich people's problem and take, put it in the poorer places in the region. So that's a really tricky one. And it needs central government leadership, because actually we need to deal with it at the source, not at the end point, So hoping that our homegirl Eugenie comes through with some awesome policy, hopefully maybe in time for the election, so because that will definitely be a thing that would help me decide on my vote. So yeah, but it's definitely a challenge, and I totally agree with you. So that's a kōrero that we need to have as Wellington as well, I think.
Yeah, kia ora, Oscar. There was something just last week or the week before, and I'm not totally up to speed about it, but it shifted the onus back onto the manufacturers for the types of plastics that they're producing, for example. So like I say, I don't know enough about it, but I think that's one of the things is it's about accountability, right? So who is accountable for waste, and there's a whole lot of rationales that get trotted out for around ease of transportability of products, that they need to be in certain sizes and shapes and wrapped in certain things to get them from one place to another. And yet those people are never, the people that we're easing the transport route for are never the ones that are paying for or accountable for, when you get your thing of tofu and your plastic just goes in the bin, and then we deal with it as a collective for the next 500 years. So I think it's about thinking critically about putting the onus back on the producers of plastic waste, and keeping, hard out, keeping the responsibility for that. Where we are producing waste, keeping it local and not shipping our plastics off to some distant shores where they just get burnt instead of recycled anyway. Yeah.
And just to add to that, that the spatial plan might be an opportunity, or planning for growth might be an opportunity to talk about that too, because it'd be really cool if people said that they wanted more public space for things like marakai, or like community gardens, because I know that the Kai Cycle model is really successful in that it creates a community garden that, when they're replenishing that soil, it sequesters more carbon, it gives people opportunities to volunteer, people learn more about their kai, they're creating it themselves, it means a healthier population. So I think that's a really good conversation that we should have as young people is, yes, let's go for higher density because it creates less emissions, but also let's make sure that there's abundant public space and lots of green space, lots of space for us to have things like community gardens and all of that kind of good stuff, yeah.
Any more questions? One over here? Oh gosh, there's a lot. I'll go here.
Sorry, I've not been here the whole time. But did you mention anything about farming emissions?
We haven't. We didn't talk about it, but I didn't, because it doesn't really make up any of our city's emissions, so it's not really something that I'm thinking about. But if you want to add.
Did you have a particular question related to farming emissions, or just general comment?
Yes, just general comments.
So I'm not fully familiar with the policy, but the government has got a policy for addressing farming emissions, and again that's on the Ministry for the Environment's website in their climate change section. It's got a lot of detail in there. Yes.
Yeah, just really quickly, no, we haven't talked about it. Yes, it is something that we need to talk about, and have some nuanced discussions about, which I have to say Federated Farmers and other rural advocate organisations are often quite obstructive around, which is a real shame, because the whole rural economy and farming itself as a profession relies on predictability of the weather. So it's really sad to watch that, I have to say. And also they're missing a whole lot of opportunities for how they could be contributing to climate justice. So it was interesting thinking and talking about retrofitting houses. Well, at the moment there's no profit, there's no value placed on wool. So farmers are literally dumping wool down the side of a bank because it costs them money to get their sheep shorn. Is the situation at the moment. Imagine if we took that wool and we were using that in our state and social housing to retrofit that. Wouldn't that be amazing? But the other thing, the thing that makes me especially annoyed is we can't, because they've been so obstructive, I don't also want to advocate for them, but I also want to acknowledge that farming and food production is actually an essential, it's essential for us. There's other luxury carbon emissions that we should be cutting first, and easier areas. So, the main growth in our emissions has come from transport. So maybe transport's a better focus for at the moment. But because there have been such chain dragging, like bad people, and I won't use a swear word, I also like we need to talk about them getting on board with this stuff, because it's actually better for the rural sector as well to talk about this. Same one.
Thank you. Just a little bit about waste management. I got the idea, you probably don't know as much about it, but there was the plan for Wellington City Council to introduce the organic waste management collection. And I wanted to know if it will be happen or not because after COVID. And just a little remark about after dividing rubbish, recycling, and it's more than 50% of leftovers. It's more than 50% going to the landfill. And there is a technology which was introduced to the government, and they decided it's the most efficient and needs the least investment, anaerobic digestion, biogas, if anybody heard about it. So I want to know why it's not exist here in Wellington. So what we can do to promote it more, and what we can do to it can be implemented easily. It's not as expensive, and in Europe, in Canada, they use it pretty much often, and it's efficient. Thank you.
Thank you. So the Green Waste trial, that's meant to start, it's before the end of the year, and that's only in Miramar, and I think it's like in October or something. To be honest, I'm not a big fan. Like having a truck driving around, creating more emissions, picking up people's waste, to me it just symbolises the fundamentally broken mindset that we have, that is is that you consume something and then you get rid of it, and then it's out of sight, out of mind. It's the reason why our landfills, our landfill is full. It's the same reason why we are so wasteful with water, is that it's just not our problem. And so I think if people are actually intimately involved with their food waste and able to put it back into their gardens and create more kai, then that's a more sustainable option than having a truck drive around. So it's not that I'm not going to support it, but I'm going to be advocating for more community composting centres, for more community gardens versus having a truck drive around. And then in terms of the biogas stuff, we've had some conversations with different stakeholders throughout the city, and to me it seems like you can have, again, better impacts through having communities actually actively involved in that process, and having those community composting centres, and having much more localised solutions. I think it kind of goes back to what you were saying about we look so hard for all these. It's definitely something we can investigate, but again, we're dealing with peanuts at a local government level, and it's probably something that would need to be funded at a central government level, but especially during a 1 in 100 year recession. But again, it's like we have such an obsession with all these new technological advancements, when actually the best things we can do are the simplest things that we can do, are the things that we do in a collective, versus the things that we do that, they reinforce the out of sight, out of mind mindset. They reinforce an individualised mindset. So it's actually about people feeling responsible for their collective, being actively involved in their community, as opposed to those quick technological fixes. So and I think that's kind of where a lot of my colleagues are sitting too. So that's probably where we'll be going. But always happy to meet and have a corridor. Always open to that.
Just quickly, quick remark. Yeah, I understand totally about smell and running around the cars with the liquid from it. But in the buildings with multi apartments, there could be disposers, or how it's called in the sink, when it can ground it in little pieces. Disposer? So it can go to the wastewater treatment, and the rest can be treated properly. So it's going together with the sewage, everything together. So I still arguing it can be done properly, even in the CBD, because the CBD is the worst now.
Cool. I think, unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. I'm going to come back over here. But I would just like to ask you guys to give a brief rundown. Wait, let me find it. Just to end this, why do we need to care about the environment, the selection, and what we can do as individuals to make an impact in our communities?
Well, we should care about the environment because we are deeply enmeshed, entwined, and part of the environment. We're not separate from it. So it's about life in every sense of the word itself. And what we can do as individuals, what I think we can do is go beyond being individuals and join with some others else. So I think I spent ages when I was doing my PhD in particular, and I would wake up at 3 a.m. and just feel like the weight of climate change on my chest, like, holy shit, what are we going to do? That only got better when I started hanging out with people and doing stuff as a group of people I liked and trusted, while knowing that those actions alone were not going to solve a global issue. That's what made it, number one, sustainable and long-lasting for me, to be with people I liked, to have fun doing activist stuff, and to give me a sense of agency and efficacy, to make me feel like I had a degree of power in a situation that otherwise makes me feel quite powerless. And it doesn't have to be, your local anarchist group, although totally, please do join your local anarchist group if you would like to. Definitely advocate that. But you could go along to your local residents association meeting, and actually, your local city councillor might well be there, and you will get to know Brian or Bruce, the inevitably white elderly Pākehā chair of the residents association, and he might be your next best mate. I don't know. There's a whole lot of other groups like 350, TUI, which is a group that's kind of connecting people up who are interested in climate change. The key thing is finding people, and people that you like as well. I think, yes, we need to get beyond people we like and have diverse conversations, but in terms of our activism, our sense of efficacy, finding people you like and want to hang out with is what is going to keep us in there for the long haul as well, I reckon. Yeah, so do that, and vote, and find people you like.
First, I just wanted to say thanks so much, Grace, for organising this. It's been a really awesome panel. And everyone else, Sophie, Joanna, everyone that organised it, thank you. I feel like everyone here cares about the environment, so I'm not going to say that, because I think we all know that it matters. But again, yes, I think it's really important that we have those conversations with people who might not, and I think that's actually a really good suggestion about going to residents association meetings, because one, young people never go to those, and therefore when you're there you're kind of like a bit of a novelty, and they kind of want to hear what you have to say. So I think take advantage of that, and they represent you in a way too, so having that conversation with them, or your local councillor or whatever, having a cordial with them and letting them know what matters, I think is actually really effective. But I think, it's about going back to people who might not necessarily agree with us or see, don't waste time convincing people who just straight out do not care. That's just a massive waste of your time and energy. But people who might care, or people who have families and care about the future, or people who you think you might be able to have a chance at convincing them that they should vote in alignment with the environment or with socially just policy. Focus your energies there. Again, try and avoid the crisis framing. It doesn't really compel people to act, and kind of just freaks people out, turns them off, makes them even more apathetic. So, and just take the opportunity that you can, whether it's in a cafe, on the bus, just having a kōrero with someone and ask them like, hey, are you enrolled to vote, or what are like the key issues that you care about? And I think you'll find that when we do more of that, we actually start to have an impact. Just an example of that really quickly is that in Ireland, when they had their abortion referendum, whether to legalise it or not, they did a survey of swing voters and asked them what was the thing that ultimately persuaded you to vote yes or no in the end. And all of them, sorry, not all of them, 40% of them said that it was actually conversations with people that they loved and trusted that that swayed them one way or another in the end. And that goes back to what Amanda's saying. We're living in a world full of information, full of facts, full of evidence, and you can find evidence that backs up really any side of the argument. So really utilise the potential and the opportunity that you have with your whānau and your friends and your community to influence them to vote. And we've got to move beyond our own echo chambers, otherwise we won't be able to change anything. So yeah, just build up that confidence, do it for Te Taiao, and yeah, cool, Chair.
Well, I agree. People here are highly likely to already know that the environment matters. There's only one environment, as David Parker, the Minister, says, and we should take care of it because it's not coming back if we haven't taken care of it. In terms of the things that as individuals you can do, it's really boring. I often say, I'm going to write to the council about this and I'm going to write to the council about that, and it's very, it's seldom do any of us participate in any of those processes. As a government agency, we would really, really welcome anybody taking an interest and just letting us know what you think. It's very hard to get people excited about whether or not they support or don't support changes to the controls, which are like the conditions on hazardous substances, and yet they're really important things. But it's just quite difficult to get anyone excited about that. So I totally agree. If you've got the opportunity to participate and you've got a spare half an hour, it's really worthwhile in terms that people will actually take what you say into consideration. It's really important. But then as an individual, there's also lots of little things that you can do. So the reduce, reuse, recycle is really important. I've only recently become aware of how difficult it is. As I said at the beginning, I have 7 compost bins, so I obviously do quite a lot of composting of things in my garden. But if you are in a flat or a high-rise, it's really difficult to know how to dispose of things like that. But there's likely to be a local community garden that has a compost. If you're prepared to put the stuff in a bucket and take a little bit of a walk, you can feel good about how you've actually done your bit to help rather than putting it in the landfill. So there's just lots of little things that you can do. And just think of the power of the plastic bag. 5 years ago, everybody thought that they had to go to the supermarket and use plastic bags. It was sort of like, it was the end of the world that they were phasing out plastic bags. There were some quite interesting comments. And yet now all of us take our bags with us to the supermarket. And the power of individuals is really important.
Cool, thank you. Can we get a round of applause for these amazing panelists? I'd like to give a shout out because this wasn't just a VUWSA event, it was done in collaboration with Roots and Shoots and also Generation Zero at Vic, and they were a very big help. So I think my last message to all of you is to please go out and vote and to talk to everyone you know. Talk to your dad who is like, probably doesn't care, well, my dad doesn't, I don't know, care about the environment. You know, go and talk to people who don't care about the things that you talk about and get them to care. Because we aren't going to really make much change this election if we don't go out and talk to people who are not within our own bubble. So that's it from me. I'll be around to chat here afterwards if anyone wants to come by. But thank you all so much for coming. I have some gifts to give out, so I'll do that. But yeah, that is the end. Thank you all for coming.